Yeah.
Wonderful. It is my great pleasure to introduce this session, the final session of today. We're extremely fortunate to have Cynthia Dwork and Kate Crawford in conversation. Cynthia is a computer science professor at Harvard University, extremely well known for her many deep and foundational contributions in cryptography and privacy and fairness. And Cynthia will give us a proper introduction of Kate, but I just want to say that I'm so excited for this session. I've really been looking forward to this. Thank you both.
Thank you very much, Katrina. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I'm delighted. I will be introducing Kate Crawford. You will see this image several times during the course of the discussion. Kate is the author. But let me really start this properly. So Dr. Kate Crawford is a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research New York. She's a research professor at USC Annenberg, an honorary professor at the University of Sydney, and the inaugural visiting chair for AI and Justice at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Kate is a founder. She founded the FATE, Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics Group at Microsoft Research, the AI Now Institute at NYU, and the Foundations of Machine Learning International Working Group at the ENS. Kate's work also includes visual investigations. Her award-winning project, Anatomy of an AI System with Vladan Joler, is in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Her investigative project, Excavating AI on the Archaeology of Training Datasets, which was done in collaboration with Trevor Paglen, won the Ireton Prize from the British Society for the History of Science. The archaeology of training datasets and other topics are discussed in Crawford's latest book, The Atlas of AI, which investigates the many different costs and risks of computing at a planetary scale. And it was published by Yale University Press just a few months ago in 2021. Science described the book as a timely and urgent contribution, and I could not agree more, although they could have added the word infuriating. Perfectly aligned with the concerns of this symposium on the foundations of responsible computing, the Atlas of AI will be the subject of our discussion. For the audience, please ask questions in the chat. We will devote the last 15 minutes to audience questions, and Solon Barocas has kindly agreed to moderate the Q&A because I can't multitask. Okay. So with that, and one more time, this message. Thank you for joining us, Kate. Maybe we can begin by having you tell us a bit about the scope of the Atlas AI and its understanding of AI as a fundamentally extractive process that begins in the ground and does not end even at our own doorsteps.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. And can I say it's a pleasure to see you and to be in conversation with you today and to give my thanks to the organizers of this conference. It's been an extraordinary list of papers that I've been enjoying at a slightly different time zone, but it's really important work. So it's very much my honor to be here today. In terms of Atlas of AI, the genesis of this book is really coming from sort of the last 10 years of my research in looking at the way in which AI/ML has really been very much focused on a set of predominantly mathematical concerns, looking at technical systems, and in many cases, treating systems as though they are quite immaterial and abstract. And I think there are political stakes to that choice. And what I've done in this book is to really open up the question of how is AI made? And I mean that in the fullest sense, in terms of what are the natural resources and minerals that it takes to make the systems on which it runs? What are the forms of human labor that are often hidden all along the supply chain in terms of what it takes to make these systems work? And then, of course, the vast amounts of data that is required to actually, again, allow these systems to make interpretations and predictions. So in doing that, this book is really constructed almost like geological strata, starting with the Earth, moving through labor, data, classifications, affect, how the state uses these systems, and then ultimately in space, how we're starting to see the people who have benefited the most and profited the most from these systems now, of course, funding a private space race. So really looking at those strata together and thinking about how they co-inform each other, how they constitute this sort of much wider ecology of artificial intelligence. And this is why I sort of use the metaphor of an atlas. You know, atlases allow us to look at things at different scales. We might look at the scale of a continent or zoom in to a specific city or a mountain range. And that interlacing of scale is something that I think is so important and I think helpful in terms of how we connect the specific technical and mathematical concerns that I think are dealt with so superbly by this community with the wider concerns around climate, around labor rights, and around data protections.
Thank you for that. You have done a lot of, in the course of the book, you relate some of the issues that you raise here to their historical antecedents. So maybe you could just say a few words about what you said about San Francisco. And
I love that you brought that up. I mean, certainly methodologically, one of the things that was so structural to the work of this book was really going back to history and doing a historiographic analysis, not just of kind of key ideas in computation, but also the landscapes and locations where particular types of industries were formed. And so in some ways, for me, going back to California as such a sort of a central node of how we understand contemporary computing, I wanted to go back to look at, really the origins of San Francisco as a city and where its wealth came from, which of course came from the mining of gold and silver in both California, but also nearby in Nevada. And I went back to some of those locations that have now become overlaid with new types of extraction. We could think here of the lithium mines in Silver Peak, one of the locations that I visit in the book. Lithium has become the new gray gold for computation. It's essential for lithium-ion batteries. We have a few grams in an iPhone. We have, over 60 kilograms required in the production of, say, a Tesla Model S car. So, this substance, which again is now deemed to be a critical supply mineral, has sort of become this new way of enriching San Francisco. So I'm sort of looking at these layers of extraction that have these long histories. And of course, in thinking about extraction, we have to sort of connect real world mining with data mining and to look at the way in which they are actually deeply connected in terms of how these industries function and how AI works at scale. So again, it's about bringing in that materiality to how we think about systems, and also, in another way, bringing AI, if you will, back to earth, grounding it in the actual ground from which we draw these minerals, this energy, and of course, so many of the production systems upon which algorithms rely.
right. So beautiful analogies. You also, one of the themes that comes up a lot is this sort of perception of AI as a clean technology. But when you get down to talking about what's going on in the lithium mines, the lithium mining, the pollution that it causes, the finiteness of lithium as a resource, can you just say a few words about those two, the aspects, and how clean is lithium mining, and also what's known about lithium supplies, like at current rates? When do people expect they might not be available anymore?
Well, this is very timely, of course, because the Biden administration in last month just released an executive order stating how important it was to shore up the critical supply chains of minerals like lithium and rare earth, which are crucial for the production of all of our sort of consumer computational devices, but also sort of the backbone of computation itself and the cloud and data centers. And one of the things that's interesting is, of course, this perception that ML, but more broadly, the tech industry, is commonly seen as a green industry, as something that, you know, is really working on ideas and math, and that doesn't connect to sort of enormous energy expenditures. And one of the revelations for me in working on this book was just discovering how dirty the production chains are. If I trace this back, really, when my thinking shifted was when I did the Anatomy of an AI System, a project with Ladan Jola, which we started back in 2016. And we looked at all of the components that are required to make a single Amazon Echo, you know, one of those little sort of beige cylinders that you might have, you know, sitting on your kitchen bench as a voice-enabled AI system. It looks, you know, like a very straightforward technology. We don't necessarily think about where it comes from. But what we did is we traced the entire sort of birth to death cycle of one of these devices. That meant going back to finding where each of the components is coming from, where the mines are, how it's smelted, and how it's transported, the container shipping, and then all the way through to the end of life, to where these devices are disposed, generally within 4 to 5 years is sort of the lifespan of one of these devices. And they get thrown away in waste dumps in places like Ghana and Pakistan, which also leave a toxic legacy for both sort of the water and the earth in those locations. And in doing this, I mean, it's kind of extraordinary to think about the way in which we're extracting billions of years of geological time in order to serve a split second of technological time. And I think in some ways we've had this belief that all of these sort of minerals are infinite and we could just keep going. But what we're seeing, of course, and lithium is just one, cobalt is another, where we are reaching an absolute end of supply point. It is now a sort of a critically urgent issue. In fact, a new report was just published back in February at the University of Gothenburg that showed that if we, and that's if, we get much better at recycling lithium, we may have consistent supply until around 2100. If we don't, and if we continue to use lithium at the same rate or to increase that rate, we're looking at around 2040, where we actually hit a limit of known supply. So that's an extraordinary, very short runway that we're talking about in terms of things that we assume are always going to be there. And I think we have hints of this coming out right now with the semiconductor crisis. I know many of us have been tracking that. It's affecting everything from cars to computers, but we're going to start to see this occur time and time again. And for me, bringing those stories into how we start to think about compute is so important as we're seeing the models get bigger and as we're seeing the amount of energy being used in things like, say, GPT-3 become just so vast that we have to think differently about the way in which we're consuming resources for AI.
Thank you for that. Let's continue in that direction. So in your chapter titled Earth, you discuss the energy consumption of model training, where you wrote that UMass Amherst's Emma Strubel's team found, quote, found that running only a single NLP model produced more than 660,000 pounds of carbon dioxide emissions, the equivalent of 5 gas-powered cars over their total lifetime, including their manufacturing, or 125 round-trip flights from New York to Beijing. So first, can you help us to calibrate this? I don't know whether a model is run once a month or 3 times a day. So I'd like you to help us calibrate that. And also, well, let's start with that, and then I have a follow-up question. Yes.
Well, I wish I knew, Cynthia, because of course, you know, models are being run all the time, and Emma's work was so important. And of course, it's been followed on by other teams. And I think indeed we could also look at the Stochastic Parrots paper, authored by Timnit Gebru, Margaret Mitchell, and others, looking at the energy costs of large language models. And there are others, work by David Anderson at Berkeley has also been looking at these questions and looking at how much energy waste there might be in running models. But often these studies are done by looking at the sort of university usage of models, and rarely do they contend with what's happening at the industrial level. If we think about sort of, you know, the big six in terms of the sorts of enormous scale models that are being run by the largest technology companies, we have almost nothing really to go on in terms of just the total energy costs of these systems. And that's partly because I think companies have been extremely cautious in sharing that information. It's kept in many cases as a corporate secret. I think that's very dangerous. We should be able to see and understand what it costs to make these models. And certainly, I mean, how else will we come up with a calculus of what is being built and whether it's worth it? So those ideas of cost, I think, need to change. And there was a paper more recently that was looking at building carbon calculators. Joël Pineau and others have published attempts to try and calculate this. But again, it's often at the sort of university sort of lab level. And we have this massive industrial infrastructure that in many cases is escaping attention.
So just let me just follow up quickly on one point. So I didn't read Struppel's paper. So the model that she was talking about, who did that one? Was that an academic project? And what did it do? What did it accomplish?
Yes, it was an academic project, and she did this paper in collaboration with her colleagues at UMass Amherst, and she was specifically looking at NLP models. And so we can also think about sort of the difference between NLP models and large computer vision models, and certainly what happens when you start to look at, say, the training of models using large-scale video training sets. I mean, we're talking about just like enormous compute questions. Although, again, even here, we can't assume that sort of NLP and sort of language-based models are somehow, you know, less energy intensive. I mean, again, mentioning GPT-3 and just looking at the extraordinary number of hyperparameters and the compute required is vast. So certainly that turn, I think, is something that we need to think about much more deeply, because there is, as you know, this sort of trend towards now throwing as much compute as you can at a problem to try and achieve particular forms of, you know, accuracy improvements. And I think it's produced, if you will, almost a type of laziness that the you know, best way to improve a model is just simply to, you know, increase the amount of compute. I just don't think that that is something that we can afford anymore. And certainly there is a move. It's quite recent, I'd say, just in the last couple of years, but we are seeing, you know, groups of computer scientists try to think about more efficient forms of ML production. And I'm really excited to see those trends develop further, but we have a long way to go because it's coming at the same time as this big energy and I think industry shift rather towards what's called AI supercompute. So, you know, we're at a bit of an inflection point, I think, in terms of how we begin to value accuracy and precision over what was the energy cost of actually producing this model.
Great. I just had this memory back to college days where the Fortran compiler ran every 20 minutes and you would, you know, input your program on cards, and then you'd better sit there and stare at it for a long time before revising and trying again.
Yeah, exactly. And that was something that I think,
in between runs.
Yeah. Right. And many of us remember that also, you know, if you go back to the 90s, that idea that, you know, you had to be so careful about the size of your code because, you know, you just knew that the amount of compute that you had was so limited, or the number of hours that you had to sort of run on the university stack was so limited. And you'd be like, oh, I can run it from like 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. and I have to be really careful about what I do. That relationship to resources really fundamentally broke, I think, in the sort of mid 2000s. And we're seeing it come back, both in terms of the sort of the end of Moore's law, but this sort of this push to forever increased compute. So I think we have hit a really crucial limit. And the question is, do we have enough time to really start thinking about this before we come right up into the kind of interstices of severe forms of climate change?
Right. So you actually touched on one of my next questions, which is, depending on what model you're training, what it's going to be used for, it may or may not be worth the price. It depends on what the model would allow us to do. So there are people who argue that for certain applications, you actually save energy because of what you have learned from the model. Can you comment on that? Certainly, is it true? Are they right? Can you give examples?
Well, absolutely. I think there are examples, and there are a small handful of oft-cited examples. And of course, one of those, for example, is DeepMind's work looking at energy consumption inside data centers, and they looked at that almost with the same sort of game engine properties in terms of how do you sort of shift the temperature controls. Where would you think about sort of moving louvers, shifting compute times, thinking about temperature, using those ideas as a way to try and reduce energy consumption. I think, that is actually a really excellent example. But it's interesting because here too, how do we know how much energy it takes to actually train and create that model? So we're not really comparing apples with apples, if you will. We're just hearing about, oh, this is a fantastic way to address energy consumption without thinking about the cost of that approach itself. So to some degree, this is why I think it's so important that we have more information that's being published about the true cost of these models, because otherwise we're simply in the dark around its supposed improvements. It's interesting too, I see in the comments that Vitaly is noting that, certainly unlike natural materials, energy is limitless if we start to think about renewables. But it's interesting even here too, David Wallace-Wells, the environment reporter who's been looking closely into systems like Bitcoin, has found that, again, in the sort of proof of work and energy requirements has meant that it is already, Bitcoin is consuming as much energy as we're producing with solar. So, that is a fairly horrifying metric. There are disputes around exactly how much energy is being used, and that I think is not our focus here. But what we do know is that they are very energy intensive, to such a degree that even with renewables doing what they're doing, we're reaching a hard limit. So I guess I'm less optimistic that we can simply say, we have renewables and we can fix these problems.
Okay, interesting. Maybe later, as part of an audience, I can talk about Bitcoin for a moment. But in the meantime, so I'd like to turn to your chapter 3 on data. So that's the first chapter in the book that really significantly intersects with the topics that so far have appeared in the first 2 FORC symposia. So the choice of how individuals are represented to an algorithm and the choice of proxies for outcomes are known vectors for the introduction of bias. Your investigation starts even earlier, discussing the extractive processes for obtaining data, often by flagrant and unconsented repurposing. So the question of mugshots comes to mind. I'd like to focus first on the subjectivity of labeling, both in the process of choosing the labels or bins into which, the set of choices that we allow for each datum to be thrown into, and the subjectivity of the labeler. So the choice of the categories and the subjectivity of the labeler who puts a datum into one of these categories. These are themes that arise in your discussion of ImageNet, but also in later chapters on the weaponization of AI and in the chapter on affect. So maybe you could start with the person category in ImageNet. Why did you choose that focus, and what does it tell us about object detection more generally?
Well, this was an investigation that was done with Trevor Paglen over multiple years in a project called Excavating AI. And in that project, we looked at hundreds of training data sets, and we looked at them in a method that we sort of described as almost like an archaeology of data sets. We opened them up and looked not just at the sort of specific datum, but also at the taxonomies of classification. What were the classes? What were the supersets? How were classes related to each other? And it was when we took on ImageNet, which is a vast set. It has over 14 million images, over 20,000 categories, that we started to really see the complexity, but also difficulty in really looking at what training sets have inside them and how they order and classify the world. we chose the people category, I think, for many reasons that I think are clear to many of us, in the sense that even though it's by no means one of the most commonly used ImageNet sets, and that was certainly our point, that, you know, for object recognition, it's not seen as a core set, but it had been there and had been used in production level systems for a decade, you know, open on the internet, and hadn't received very much scrutiny in terms of how it worked. So what we did is we spent a lot of time sort of looking at the, you know, sort of over 2,700 categories of people, starting with the most highly populous ones, terms like gal or CEO, and then moving to some of the, again, slightly more obscure, categorizing people by their profession, such as a microeconomist or a basketballer, and then looking at the images of who was being classified there. And immediately you can see that, you know, forms of classificatory prejudice would emerge in terms of the fact of, you know, that we would see more black people in the basketball category, more white people in the CEO category, almost entirely white men. But then as we moved further into these categorizations, we found incredibly troubling terms like slut, call girl, kleptomaniac, bad person, drug user. And of course, these are terms which have hundreds of images of people scraped off the internet. They have no idea that they're being attached to this name or concept. And in addition to that, there are several completely non-visual concepts. For example, you know, there's a category for acquaintance or friend. You know, what is it to be an acquaintance? That's a relation to something else. It's not something that you contain in a single visual image. So how do we think about this? Well, of course, ImageNet itself was coming from the collection of nouns drawn from WordNet, a project that was produced in Princeton in the 1980s. But WordNet, again, itself was built on other categories, includes subsets from things like the Brown corpus, which again was produced even decades earlier than that, and is based on a collection of thesauri. So you have these ideas that were from decades earlier, terms that had completely fallen out of use, professions like washerwoman, which, you know, continued to appear in ImageNet with people connected to it from contemporary times. And you can see there's a disconnect between these kind of genealogies of classifications that had persisted in this incredibly important training set, which was so foundational for object recognition. So there's several questions we need to ask ourselves when we start to classify people like objects where it fails us. But also, and this is a point that's made in Solon Barocas's book with Moritz Hart and Arvind Narayanan, is the way in which, you know, we often think that technology systems are moving much quicker than sort of social ideas and social relationships. Sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes technical systems have these very old ideas baked into their classifications, and society's moved on. So it really feels at odds with what we know. So here, I think, you know, in relation to your question, this idea of the way in which those classifications actually relate to subjectivity is really important here. The subjectivity of the label, which come from, again, teams who are saying, okay, we're going to collect a series of words, so we're going to get it from, again, if we take the Brown corpus has some extraordinary sources. It has novels that were being written in the 1930s and 40s with titles like Who Rules the Marriage Bed and Simple Lessons in Witchcraft. And, you know, these become the kind of core texts for the Brown corpus, which then, you know, have these family histories that sort of end up in places like ImageNet. So again, tracing the histories of training data for me is so important if we're going to understand subjectivity and labeling. But you also, I noticed in your question, Cynthia, introduce this other important point, which is the subjectivity of the labeler. And this is where we have to talk about labor, because of course, where ImageNet was also so important was that it was one of the first to use Amazon Mechanical Turk, which was launched back in 2005, if I recall correctly. And so it was that moment where they realized they could label by hand so many more of these 14 million images if they gave them to crowd workers and said, you have 50 images to label in a minute, so go. And imagine what that's like when all you have is these terms and then a Wikipedia definition, and you're looking at a set of images and you're like, okay, this is washerwoman, or this is kleptomaniac, or this is debtor. What does a debtor look like? How can you understand their bank account? I don't know. I'll just look at people who might look a bit shady, you know, and like this, but this almost is asking people to play to easy visual prejudice and heuristics that I think are really questionable. So I want to put this in context with the fact that absolutely ImageNet achieves so much and has been so important in the fields of object recognition, but has within it such an important example of where classifications fail us and where those quote unquote subjectivities are actually very dangerous in terms of how we interpret the world.
Excellent, excellent points. I saw that you also had referred to Virginia Eubank's book.
Yes.
Which gives very, very good illustrations of this in the context of the Allegheny Family Child Protective Services algorithms. So,
such an important book. And again, her work, I think, has been just so groundbreaking in terms of thinking about where best intentions, you know, really the attempt to create fairer systems could actually lead us astray when we don't think about those underlying classifications that are in many ways discriminating against the poor, discriminating against people of color, discriminating against people who may in any other way look different to a particular standardized norm. So, I mean, I think that's such important work in this context.
Right, but also she focuses quite a bit on the difference in expressivity of the description of an individual, because say if it is a poor person, then there's much more information about them because they've used resources of the state for substance abuse programs and other medical issues that a private person, a person who can go to private care and pay privately, doesn't have to share with the state. So the fields that are being used may seem reasonable on some level, but they have extremely different meanings for different groups.
Exactly right. And I think that's also such an important point for, I think, moving away just from the question of subjectivity. So we think about subjectivity at the sort of individual human layer, but what you've just pointed to is actually structural differences in terms of how much data is understood about particular groups and how it skews towards particular results. And that is an institutional history. That shows us that these institutional histories completely shape how data is understood. And I always think of this fantastic work by Lisa Gittelman, who wrote back in 2011 about the way in which data has to be imagined and constructed by institutions before it's recognized even as data. And before we can sort of say, oh, this is objective data, we have to think how it was imagined or brought into being by institutions. And if those institutions are over collecting from particular groups, or as you say, are really understanding that these are the important signals to be gathering to understand context. What gets left out? What are the things that institutions don't see? Who are the groups that they see much more of? You know, those are the questions that we have to ask before we can even understand the way a data set is actually trying to represent the world.
Excellent points, yes. Let's move on to, if it's possible, to call it an even more disturbing chapter. I personally found your chapter on affect very, very disturbing. As the whole notion of affective computing, the suggestion that not only is it possible, but we are enabling people to read emotions that I choose not to share. I do not want to tell them what I'm thinking. This feels terribly invasive. So while I might be reassured by your assessment and your reference to research that it just doesn't work,
Right.
Still, the use of affective computing continues to grow, for example, in employment screening. And in fact, reading your book made me think back to an old problem. This is basically an old problem in a new form. So the 2003 National Research Council report called The Polygraph and Lie Detection found that, and I'm quoting, polygraph testing yields an unacceptable choice for DOE employee security screening between too many loyal employees falsely judged deceptive and too many major security threats left undetected. Its accuracy in distinguishing actual or potential security violators from innocent test takers is insufficient to justify reliance on its use in employee security screening in federal agencies. So I'm emphasizing here that this is trying to figure out, to predict how people will behave should you employ them. And yet in 2006, we find testimony of Steve Feinberg, the chair of the committee that wrote the polygraph report, asking, again, quoting, how did DOE square these conclusions with its plan to continue the polygraph policy unchanged? So Kate, please speak to 3 points. I'll list them, but if you forget, we can come back. So what goes wrong with categorizing and trying to recognize emotions? 2, there's a disconnect between recognizing emotions and predicting future behavior. What do the most recent debunking studies say, particularly about the latter task? And finally, why do you think is history repeating itself? And has this been exacerbated by the pandemic?
Fantastically important questions. And thank you for making this connection to the polygraph, because I think it's a really instructive history. And if we look at the court filings and the responses around the polygraph, I find those particularly interesting, and I'm glad you went there, because of course, the lie detector test was invented back in the 1920s, and it was used by the FBI and the US military for decades, but it wasn't really until 1998, it was when the US Supreme Court, in fact, concluded that there was simply no consensus that the polygraph was reliable at all, as you've just beautifully illustrated. So think about the fact that that gave us, the better part of a century where, people's lives are being harmed, where people were being unfairly accused. This had direct impacts on employability, on so many elements of the criminal justice system as well. Of course, now the polygraph is not admissible evidence in any courtroom, but it is still used in terms of assessing government employees. We know this technology doesn't work. We know that it's profoundly skewed, and yet it's built into the administrative state. And I hate to say it, but I worry that we're seeing exactly the same thing happen with so-called emotion detection and sort of affect detection tools. So to your first question, where does this idea of categorizing emotion go awry? And I have to say that for me, and certainly in my research and going back to where these ideas came from, I think they go awry at the very theoretical underlayer, the very idea that we have 6 or 7 universal emotions, depending on who you ask, and that we display them on our faces, and that by tracking the micro expressions on our faces, you can detect internal states. These assumptions, these claims are all in many ways scientifically disputed and have been since their inception. So one of the things I do in the book is go back to the work of a particular psychologist, Paul Ekman, who from the 1960s onward became very much the central thinker in terms of this idea that we have universal emotions. And what was fascinating is that even back then, even in the 1960s, you had anthropologists like Margaret Mead saying, this is a terrible model. This doesn't work. It completely removes context, culture, relationality, all of the ways in which emotion isn't simply, monadic or atomistic. We don't just contain it within ourselves. It relates to where we are, who we're speaking to, what's happening at that time, whether we're listening to a piece of music, all sorts of the things that might actually construct emotions. Then we might say this idea that there are 6 emotions, which of course was his initial theory, which slightly expanded later. But even that is, again, so profoundly problematic. And I also trace the intellectual history through Sylvan Tompkins and others in terms of where those ideas come from. So to me, I think that's the first step. This idea is itself problematic. I do not believe that there are 6 universal emotions. I do not believe that by tracking people's faces that we know their internal states, and that if you smile, it means that you're happy. And anybody on this at this conference who's ever worked in the service industry, or in my case, I worked in a bookshop for many years, you know that if you're smiling doesn't necessarily mean you're happy, but that is the assumption that these systems make. Your second question, which is, the debunking studies. Well, we've actually got some fantastically strong ones. Pointing here to the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett, who did a systematic review of all of the literature based on this idea that you can detect internal states from external facial muscle movement. And she found that there was no reliable correlation between the two. And I use that language there because it echoes the Supreme Court's language in 1998 about the polygraph. It's almost the same phrasing that, that these correlations don't exist, they're not reliable, they're not consistent. So why are we using these tools in airports, in hiring, and in education? Which brings me to your third question, which is, what is happening now, particularly in relation to the pandemic? Well, tragically, what we've seen is because we're all on these Zoom calls and we're working from home and students are studying from home, is that we're seeing these tools brought to bear in places like remote education in terms of workforce management. That by studying videos like this, there's the claim that you can understand if a student is being attentive or not, that you can understand if they are confused or angry, which would flag them as somebody who needs to be followed up in particular ways. There are companies doing this right now, companies like 4 Little Trees, who are, again, looking specifically at younger children aged around sort of 10 and below, and using these ideas by tracking their faces and saying, oh, this child is angry, or no, this child is fearful, without having any sort of strong scientific backing to do so. So I'm deeply concerned by this, and like you, I do find this one of the kind of most disturbing and infuriating areas, that we are taking these systems at face value and we're not looking at the scientific disputes, and that they're getting deployed by so many startup companies as though they are fact. And this to me is extraordinarily dangerous, because it's having material impacts on everything from education, healthcare, criminal justice, where these systems are being fed in. And we have histories here too. Forgive me to have one more example, but Ekman advised the TSA in the US to create what was called the SPOT program. This came after September 11. There was enormous government interest in being able to detect a terrorist. So look at someone's face and know if this person might be a terrorist. And it did so with a lot of those polygraph type assumptions. Are they looking nervous? Are the facial expressions and movements indicating that this person is fearful? Well, who else might that pick up? Well, we think, of course, of the communities who are, again, most, I think, oppressed by forms of police questioning. We again think about the way in which that correlates with communities of color and marginalized people. And of course, they're the people who are going to be most stressed in these circumstances. And now they're being flagged as terrorists. Now, this system was used and is still used in some ways, but it has gone through review and found not to work. So I think we're having a similar moment with emotion, so-called recognition.
Great. It reminds me, I read Ekman's book maybe 20 years ago, but one of the things he said was, he understood the importance of context. He said, I may know that my teenager is lying, but I don't know why she's lying. She might have a good reason. And you're giving an example of people who are stressed, and you don't know why they're stressed. They might have a reason that has absolutely nothing to do with terrorism. And in fact, that's overwhelmingly going to be the case. And one of the problems of trying to train a system to recognize terrorists is, well, what's your training set? How many examples do you have to train on? Where are your positive examples coming from? This was a point that was emphasized in a report, another National Research Council report on privacy and the struggle against terrorism, which is further debunked. Okay, so it is time for me to give over this privilege of getting to ask you questions and learn, direct this and open up to the floor. So I don't know whether there are questions in the chat because I haven't been looking. Solon, can you tell us what there is?
There is. There's one by Aloni, so maybe he can go first.
Yeah, I can read my question. Thanks for the great discussion. Thank you both. I was wondering from the energy discussion whether we should be thinking, we as a society should be thinking about the policy problem posed by energy hungry AI as a different policy problem or the same policy problem as energy hungry endeavors that humans undertake generally. So is regulating energy in AI a special case of regulating energy consumption, or do you think that there's some, or how should we be thinking about it differently, or how should I be thinking about it differently?
Well, I wish we were at the point where we could even talk about regulating energy use. We're so far from that. We haven't even got to basic transparency. We haven't even got to the place where we would know, the energy costs of a particular model or a particular product. So for me, the urgency here is that industry is put under a lot more pressure to actually declare how much energy is used in the production of these systems and what they cost in these sort of wider material concerns. That at least would begin the discussion. And in many ways, industries in other domains have been forced to do this and are actually having to declare what it takes to actually make their systems. So in some ways, I think the technology sector has been given a real pass in this space, primarily because people don't think about it as being an energy intensive sector. I mean, interestingly, data centers overtook the aviation industry in terms of carbon footprint 3 years before the pandemic. And certainly during the pandemic, they've deeply exceeded the airline industry in terms of its carbon footprint. So these facts were known, and yet what's happening in the move towards ever greater compute for ML isn't being put in the same sort of question of how do we think about its sort of energy consumption. So I don't think it's a special case at all. I think it's simply that we have a long way to go in terms of getting people to be aware of these issues. And also, I'll be honest with you, I think we have some low-hanging fruit. I mean, I think there are some ways in which we throw compute at things unnecessarily, that those budgeting questions that Cynthia brought up, that we were trained on, those of us who, were sort of aware of these issues back in the 90s, we need to return to thinking more carefully around how we actually use compute. I think we just got very lazy in the last 20 years. So, I mean, that would be the first way I would answer that question.
So since you are talking about energy, do you want to comment on new efforts at making computing more environmentally sustainable? I've heard about them, but I don't have any, I don't know much. So maybe you could tell us a bit.
Well, it is so new. I mentioned those 3 papers earlier in our discussion, but there are actually groups that are now forming. There are a couple in Europe. There's actually a group at ENS that's looking specifically at the energy requirements for large-scale computation. There's a series of early career scholars that are working on this, including Emma Strubel and others. To me, though, again, what I want to see happening is less of this being purely an academic question and really to put the emphasis back on industry, where we're seeing sort of by far and away the much greater use of energy. And I think we've seen a little bit of this in terms of the back and forth around the stochastic parrots paper that Timnit and others published, and Jeff Dean's response in a paper that he co-authored with David Robinson just recently. What we're seeing is, I think, a dispute around, whether the shift to things like LLMs are necessary. Are they justifying the amount of energy that it costs to make them function? And in many ways, we're having the debate with our eyes closed. We don't have enough information to see how these decisions are being made. And so, again, as you and I have talked about for many years, Cynthia, transparency is important, but it's not enough. But it would be a nice start. That's why we really have to begin there. But it's interesting, and if I may, just before we go to the next question, take somewhat of the privilege of asking you a question, because I noticed that Fairness Through Awareness is just having its 10-year anniversary this year. Can you believe it? And I was thinking about the way in which we've scoped the idea of fairness, certainly over the last decade, and how you are interested in how it might change. How might we think about fairness in different ways that could include these sort of wider lens issues, wider angle issues, if you will, around energy and labor. And I'd love to put that to you, Cynthia, and hear from your perspective how fairness itself might start to contend with these questions.
So I don't have your knack for going way up into the stratosphere and looking at the whole problem. I don't have, I don't have the Atlas mentality that Kate Crawford has. But I have been thinking quite a bit about these questions of how do you know when your representation of individuals is even remotely correct, or whether you're capturing the features that are in fact relevant to what it is you're trying to understand about people. And I've also been, so one example that you would expect is that you should have some kind of variability, that the data should at least be able to capture the fact that people are multifaceted. And so, and for different and arbitrary groups of people, you would want that same kind of sweep. You would expect that same kind of variability. So that's one example. But I don't know how to solve this problem. I just know that it needs to be focused on. I found the examples, particularly in Eubank's book, is totally persuasive. That this is urgent. So, yeah. Solon, do we have a question from Adam?
That's right. Anna, if you want to go ahead.
Sure, I can, yeah. So coming back to effective computing, there was sort of like, to oversimplify a little bit, and I'm sorry, two parts to the argument. One was that, like, these systems for kind of automatically recognizing or detecting emotional states don't work very well. And B, like, even when they are doing something, detecting something that might just be like uncorrelated to the important thing, right? Like, terrorist state, whatever that means. And I agree on both points, but I wonder if that first point the nature of the argument will have to change over time. And it just seems there are lots of places where AI is sort of just good enough to be dangerous. And like, maybe we'll be there with effective computing, or maybe we're there, I don't know. But maybe maybe the problem will come from the fact that it's kind of reasonably effective, but like so far from perfect and biased and just problematic in all sorts of ways. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Adam, thank you. This is such an important question, and it's important because I think it applies to many of the domains that this community focuses on. Yes, absolutely, in issues of recidivism and credit risk, but we could also think of things like facial recognition as something that is slowly, quote unquote, improving. And so many of the first generation criticisms were that it didn't work on people with darker skin tones, it didn't work on women as well as men, etc. Whereas I think the deeper criticism is how it's being put to use, who suffers the downsides of facial recognition, what its sort of toxic presence does to civil society itself. And so, the phrase that I've used in relation to certainly facial recognition in the past is that it's, dangerous when it works and it's harmful when it fails. You kind of have both problems happening at once. But the way that I tend to analyze this, and particularly I think affect detection is a really useful example. I actually don't think it can ever work in the sense that at a core ontological level, emotions aren't things that are simply completely atomistically contained within ourselves. They are relational, they are complex, they are so varied. There are emotions that have no name. There are so many ways in which capturing the infinite complexity of thought and feeling is always going to be beyond us. It's not something that we can do. So I think there is like a fundamental philosophical question for me, and people will differ on this, but certainly from my perspective, I don't actually believe it's possible. But what you raise is actually nonetheless still a really important question, which is, as it gets better, and by better I mean you can now detect people's pulse rate from a Zoom call at distance. There was a paper about this just recently, and that you would use that to detect somebody's stress. So again, polygraph at a distance. We see again this kind of desire to find out more about people than they're willing to share, which I think is a really problematic impulse. So you're right that as they become more accurate at particular goals, there's a separate question around, does the critique shift? Well, here's where I think the core critique has to connect to essentially political economy. And the political economy is, what are these tools used for and who benefits from them? And that's why we always have to look at who's buying them, who's deploying them, and who benefits from them. And over again, you'll see the logics of profit and particular forms of ad tech in particular are very powerful in driving this. And on the other side, policing and military applications. So these are the political economies of specifically these types of tools. And it's no coincidence that we just saw Affectiva, one of the leaders in this space, purchased by an insurance company. And this is an example that many of us have used for years, is that these are the tools that are used to modulate insurance in real time. If you have a camera in your car, it's tracking your emotions and how you're behaving in that vehicle, and then using it to modulate your insurance. You can see the profit motives and why insurance agencies want to use that. And you can also see why policing agencies want to use remote polygraph tools. You're not going to escape that. So I think at a core level, this is why we sort of shift from this idea of fairness to these more core critiques of power and industrial power specifically, why these particular logics of profit and policing are behind the deployment of so many of these tools. I hope that begins to answer your question, but to me, this is one of the most important questions, is to look at not just in a sort of a narrow way how a system is designed, what it's optimized for, what its target variables might be, but where is it applied? Whose sort of profit motives is it actually working towards? And I think that's another way of broadening out the question of fairness. Thanks, Adam. Great question.
Solon, one more.
Well, you have your own question, Cynthia. Do you want to pose it?
Tempted. Okay, I will. Kate, we've been talking about affective computing in terms of classifying and predicting, but we haven't actually talked about affective computing for the purposes of manipulation. And just as an example, my advertiser, the person who is sending ads to me, doesn't have my interests at heart. They don't want me to cheer up and go outside and have a good time. They want me to stay depressed and watching stuff on YouTube. Can you speak to that?
Well, I mean, it's such an important formulation, is to think again around, how we might use affective computing in completely different ways. And, there are really, I think, important studies that are being done in what might these tools be used for that could actually be positive. I mean, in an early discussion, you mentioned how we could use these tools to help children think differently about emotion, that they've been used in studies of autism, that there are these sort of specific use cases. And yet we don't see that in terms of how these tools are deployed. They're deployed in ad tech, they're deployed in policing. And I think that should also cause us to be, I think, a little skeptical when we hear about new tools being used for very kind of socially progressive aims, or so-called AI for good, to actually look at who does use them, who does benefit from them. It does shift those kinds of questions that I think we should ask early on. And Solon, I think, this is also really interesting in relation to your question, that, thinking about the way in which affective computing is in many cases not even trying to understand underlying emotional states, certainly not in a kind of way that a person could use positively to reflect on their own behavior, or what does make them happy, if it's a walk in the park or if it's watching YouTube videos. But it's actually kind of looking really just at visual cues, kind of, audio and visual cues that you might detect from external sort of physical reactions. And that again is a very different set of parameters. But Solon, can I throw that question back to you just briefly as we close, to say, how do you see that changing over time, because there's so much money and so much research being done in this space? Do you see that we're going to keep reaching this kind of core fundamental misunderstanding around human emotion?
I just want to say, okay, this is great. I think I worry about like the response to some of this criticism being that we're miscasting the claims that the research is making, that no one's trying to infer underlying emotional states, even if maybe it's marketed that way, or even if it's adopted because they believe it's doing that. Instead, maybe the research is actually trying to say, we're simply trying to read the expressed affect of people. And we might still make judgments on that basis, just like humans do, right? So it's not this kind of, let's go beyond what humans might do in their everyday interactions. Let's simply teach machines to understand the expressed affect of people. Now, I find this dubious, and I worry that like that might seem like a powerful response. So I really wanted to hear how you would try to come back to someone who would make such a claim.
Oh, that's fantastic, because of course that's exactly what we're seeing happen. And I'm thinking here of Amazon's recognition tool, where it used to say, as recently as 2 years ago, that it could detect fear and surprise and happiness and anger. And now they've shifted the language to say, we simply show when somebody is smiling, or when they, when their eyes are wide, and it's shifting the terrain of the debate to say, well, we're just looking at physical signals. It's up to you how you interpret them. I think this is, deeply dishonest at the level of how these tools are actually being sold. So, they're changing the language because they know they cannot make the claims about internal state, but they know that that is what, many of their advertising clients and many other clients want to be able to do. So it's almost a blame shifting game. It's like, well, we're not telling you how to interpret these signals. We're just telling you when someone's smiling, or when they appear to be stressed, or when, they're flushing, which could indicate, shame or guilt or lying. To me, this is, again, a very concerning kind of shift that doesn't actually represent a change in the production theory. So no, I agree with you, but I don't think it's working. I think people are aware that that's it's pretty transparent that that's a very self-serving position from companies that are still trying to sell these tools.
So I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Kate, for meeting with us, for telling us about your fabulous work and sharing some of the insights from Atlas of AI. Thank you, Solon, for helping with the moderation, and thanks to the audience. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Cynthia. That was just a wonderful conversation. And thank you, everyone. It's been the end of a long conference, and it's just such a pleasure to see you all here. So thank you again.